In 1997, a patient was dying on an operating table in Utah when a doctor walked in and noticed a woman standing beside the gurney. She was calm and silent, just watching, wearing neither scrubs nor a visitor's badge. Nobody in the room knew who she was, and nobody had let her in. Later, when someone checked the records, they discovered that at that very moment, she was already dead. The doctor who saw the dead. To get the full picture, let's go back through the context. In December 1997, on a 2-lane highway in rural Utah, the Olsens were only a few minutes from home when the other driver crossed the center line directly into their path. The collision occurred at 120 kilometers per hour. Jeff later recalled only a flash of headlights and then the sound of twisting metal. The impact sent the Olsen's car flipping through the air. It rolled 8 times before landing on its roof. The force of 8 rolls at highway speed subjected the occupants to deceleration forces estimated at more than 20 times the force of gravity. Tamara Olsen, Jeff's wife of 11 years, died at the scene. Their 7-year-old son, Spencer, also died at the scene. Their bodies were covered and left at the crash site, while the rescue crew focused on the survivors. Jeff Olsen's body was broken in ways that would require 18 separate surgeries over 6 months of hospitalization. He suffered a crushed pelvis that required titanium plates, a torn aorta that had begun hemorrhaging into his chest cavity, ruptured intestines that spilled fecal matter into his abdomen, a collapsed lung that could not reinflate on its own, and multiple fractures in both legs. Paramedics initially could not find a pulse. He was in full cardiac arrest at the scene. But luckily, Jeff and Tamara's older son, 10-year-old Griffin Olsen, survived the crash with a broken arm and a fractured eye socket. He was conscious when rescuers arrived and later told his father that he had seen the entire accident from inside the car as it rolled, counting each flip. Griffin had no major internal injuries, but even that was strange. A child sitting in the back seat without a booster seat should not have walked away from an 8-roll crash. As for Jeff, a medical helicopter airlifted him from the crash site to a level 1 trauma center in Utah. Flight paramedics reported that Jeff's blood pressure was undetectable for the first 8 minutes of the flight. They administered 2 units of packed red blood cells directly into his intraosseous line during the flight. When Jeff was wheeled into the operating room, Dr. Audrey Skoll was the attending physician on call that night. He later told his colleagues that he believed he had witnessed every possible variation of human injury. That belief ended when he entered operating room 3. When Audrey stepped through the operating room doors, he saw the trauma team working on Jeff Olsen, but he also saw a woman standing next to the gurney. She was not wearing surgical scrubs or a visitor's badge. She just stood motionless, calm, and completely silent. Audrey walked toward the gurney to assess the patient. As he approached, the woman turned her head and looked directly at him. She smiled, and somehow he felt a strange sense that everything would be fine. He did not ask who she was or why she was there. He turned his attention to Jeff's torn aorta and began to work. But while the surgical team fought to repair his ruptured aorta and stabilize his pelvis, Jeff Olsen was not present in his body. He later described the sensation of rising upward. He saw the operating room from above. He saw the surgeons bent over his open chest, but he felt no pain or attachment to the body on the table. Then he moved away from the ceiling and towards something else. Jeff found himself standing on the edge of a lake. He described the water as impossibly blue, more vivid than any color he had ever seen on Earth. And then Tamara appeared beside him. She was healthy and radiant. Jeff later said that seeing her there was more real than seeing his own hands typing his memoir. According to Jeff, Tamara spoke to him without opening her mouth. She told him that he could not stay where he was. Jeff refused. The thought of returning to a body that was shattered, to a life where she was gone and Spencer was gone, was unbearable. But Tamara's message was not a request, so Jeff chose to come back. He simply opened his eyes in the recovery room, intubated and strapped down, and knew he was back. Jeff's return to physical life was a marathon of medical interventions. His first surgery repaired the torn aorta. His second surgery reconstructed his pelvis with titanium screws and plates. His third surgery removed a section of necrotic intestine. In total, 18 procedures were performed over 180 days. After he was discharged, Jeff told no one about the lake, Tamara, or the voice that had sent him back. He had heard stories of people who claimed to have visited heaven and were dismissed as delusional. He did not want psychiatric medication or a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress with psychotic features. He kept the experience locked inside him for more than 10 years and told no one, not even his surviving son, Griffin. Dr. Audrey Skall also told no one about the woman he had seen in the operating room. He was a respected trauma surgeon. His colleagues knew him as a data-driven, skeptical clinician. Reporting an apparition would have destroyed his professional credibility. He told himself that the woman must have been a figment of fatigue. After all, he had been on call for 20 hours. In 1929, Jeff Olsen published his memoir. In it, he described the woman at the lake and his return to the operating room. He also mentioned that he had learned of a doctor who had seen a woman standing beside his gurney during surgery. After the book was published, Jeff tracked down Dr. Audrey. He called him on the phone. He asked simply, "Did you see someone standing next to me?" Audrey went silent for a long moment. Then he said, "A woman." She smiled at me. Jeff sent Dr. Audrey Skall a photograph of Tamara. Audrey had never seen a picture of Jeff's wife, but when he opened the email attachment, he recognized her immediately. It was the same woman who had stood in his operating room. Jeff Olsen published his book called If I Should Wake, a near-death experience that changed everything in 2009. Dr. Audrey published his own account, titled The Second Face, in 2010. But the boundary between life and death is not always crossed alone. Sometimes the living go with the dying. When the living cross two. William, a volunteer hospice caregiver in San Francisco in the year 2000, was assigned to sit with a dying man named Ron, who was slowly dying from stomach cancer. Ron had few visitors, so William would spend up to 3 hours a day at his bedside, reading adventure stories. On the day of Ron's death, William was reading a passage from Jack London's Call of the Wild when he felt a sudden and complete shift in his consciousness. He later described it as an instantaneous feeling of his spirit leaving his body, rising upward toward the ceiling of the small hospice room. From that elevated position, he could see his own body still seated in the chair, the open book on his lap, his mouth still forming the words of the story. Floating beside him at the same ceiling-level altitude was Ron. The dying man was no longer gaunt and jaundiced. He appeared calm, healthy, and dressed in clothing William had never seen him wear. Ron looked at William and gave him a happy, contented look. The entire episode lasted just seconds before William felt himself drop back into his body. Ron never regained consciousness and died shortly afterward. William told no one about the experience for a long time because he feared that hospice administrators would consider him unfit for patient care. In 2009, after he learned that the term for what he had experienced was shared death experience, a phrase coined by Raymond Moody in his book Glimpses of Eternity, William began collecting other accounts, and by 2013, he had founded the Shared Crossing Project and directed its research initiative. He is now recognized by many as the world's leading authority on the shared death experience, having created the first research-based typologies for classifying the full range of shared death experiences and developing the spectrum of end-of-life experiences, a guide to help caregivers and healthcare professionals navigate phenomena that can manifest at the end of life. His research team has studied more than 1,000 documented accounts of shared death experiences. Shared death experiences are remarkable because they involve healthy observers witnessing something alongside the dying. But some of the most puzzling accounts come from people who are barely old enough to understand what death even means. When little ones resurrect. If near-death and shared death experiences were merely the brain's attempt to soothe itself with familiar imagery, children should be the least likely to report them. But somehow, children as young as 6 months old have had lucid visions and later, when able to speak, remembered them with startling clarity. As Dr. Raymond Moody himself said, "When you talk to these children, they have a maturity way beyond their age, and it is astonishing what they come back feeling and knowing." In a study of over 270 pediatric cases, PMH Atwater found that 76% reported a comforting initial experience, with many recounting a loving nothingness, a friendly voice, or a visitation by a loving being. A 2023 case series published in the journal Explore further confirmed that children's unsolicited near-death experience-type experiences include out-of-body visions, bright lights, and visits to celestial places. The most striking cases are not just about seeing light, but about seeing specific people the child should not know. In multiple documented instances, children identified grandparents or siblings who had died before they were born, later recognizing them accurately in photographs they had never seen. One of the most famous examples is Colton Burpo, a 4-year-old from Nebraska, who underwent emergency surgery for a ruptured appendix in 2003. When he woke up, Colton told his parents he had been to heaven. He said he met Jesus, John the Baptist, and a miscarried sister his parents had never mentioned. His mother had not even known the sex of the miscarried baby, but Colton told her it was a sister. Colton also described his great-grandfather, Pop, who had died 30 years before he was born. Colton said Pop had huge wings and curly hair, and he did not recognize an older photograph of the man, but he did recognize a younger picture that the family later found. When his father, a pastor, realized his son could describe where he was praying during the surgery, a detail his own wife could not have known, the pastor became 100% convinced. The most powerful evidence from children, however, comes not from their own near-death experiences, but from their innocent participation in the deaths of others. One 4-year-old girl described her grandfather's appearance in detail, down to a scar on his left arm, just at the moment of his passing. She had never seen a photograph of him. As the British neuropsychiatrist Peter Fenwick, who spent decades studying end-of-life phenomena, noted, children's accounts are often more compelling than adults because they lack adults' ability to embellish or interpret. The stories are beautiful. But is there any hard evidence that proves something actually happens inside a dying skull? What happens in a dying brain? For decades, the assumption about dying was straightforward. When the heart stopped, blood flow to the brain ceased, and consciousness flickered out like a candle. But data collected from both animal models and human patients have shattered that simplicity. Perhaps the most startling finding emerged from the laboratory of Dr. Jimo Borjigin, a neurologist and associate professor of molecular and integrative physiology at the University of Michigan. In 2013, Jimo's team performed continuous electroencephalography on rats undergoing experimental cardiac arrest and discovered something no one expected. Within the first 30 seconds after cardiac arrest, before the brain's electrical activity went flat, there was a transient surge of synchronous gamma oscillations that exceeded levels found during the conscious waking state. Gamma waves are the fastest brain waves, typically associated with attention, memory retrieval, dreaming, and conscious perception. The fact that a dying brain could generate more of this activity than a healthy, awake brain was a neuroscientific paradox. The rat study found that gamma oscillations during cardiac arrest were global, highly coherent, and exhibited a striking increase in directed connectivity across the brain, features that, in living subjects, correlate with heightened conscious processing. The natural question followed: did this phenomenon occur in humans? For a decade, Jimo's team searched for data, and in 2023, they found it. The study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, examined 4 comatose patients in a neurointensive care unit, whose life support was withdrawn after they were deemed beyond medical help. Their brains were already being monitored via electroencephalography because of suspected seizure history. The scientists retrospectively analyzed the recordings from the moment life support was removed until death. Of the 4 patients, 2 showed a sharp surge in gamma wave activity at the temporoparieto-occipital junctions, regions considered hot zones for the neural correlates of consciousness. This same area has been linked to dreaming, visual hallucinations and epilepsy, and altered states of consciousness. The gamma surge lasted several minutes and was described as extremely intense. Jimo noted that it might correspond to the patients being internally awakened. Importantly, these 2 patients also showed an increase in heart rate as their blood oxygen levels fell, suggesting that a functioning autonomic nervous system may be necessary for the gamma surge to occur. But the other 2 patients showed neither an increase in heart rate nor brain activity. Gimo was careful not to overclaim. He said it may be activating internal covert consciousness, bringing out memories of the past, or it could be a brain survival mechanism, and that we do not know. But he also stated plainly that they saw potential neurosignatures of consciousness. The study provides the first direct evidence that the dying human brain can generate the same kind of hyperactive gamma activity observed in rats, offering a potential neurophysiological correlate for the vivid experiences reported by near-death survivors. As Sam Parnia of New York University Langone Health commented, falling oxygen levels disable the brain's natural braking systems, allowing normally dormant pathways to activate and producing transient electrical spikes. The findings provide additional supporting evidence for awareness in some people who are otherwise thought to be unconscious at the end of their life. Consider the case of Anna Katharina Amer, published as a peer-reviewed case study in the journal Omega, Journal of Death and Dying in 2014 by researchers Michael Naum and Bruce Grayson. Anna was a 26-year-old German woman with profound intellectual disabilities. She had spent most of her life in the Hefata Asylum near Schwalmstadt. According to Friedrich Happich, a Protestant theologian who served as the asylum's chaplain, Anna was among the patients with the most severe mental disabilities Friedrich had ever encountered. But on the day she died of tuberculosis, Friedrich was called to her bedside by Dr. Wilhelm Wittneben, the asylum doctor. When they entered the room together, they could not believe their eyes and ears. Anna, who had never spoken a single word, was singing. She sang a hymn over and over again for half an hour. Then she quietly passed away. Both the chaplain and the doctor, hardened men of the asylum, had tears in their eyes. Wilhelm wrote about the event in very similar terms. Friedrich later reflected that Anna had not only participated superficially in all that happened around her. In reality, he said, she had apparently internalized much of it. She had comprehended the contents of this song and used it appropriately in the most critical hour of her life. This appeared like a miracle to them. Deep hypothermic circulatory arrest is a procedure that turns the brain completely off. And when patients are brought back from this cold state, some of them describe things they should not be able to describe, from angles they should not be able to see. The woman who should have seen nothing. In the history of near-death research, no single case has been debated more intensely than that of Pam Reynolds, a 35-year-old singer and songwriter from Atlanta, Georgia, who in 1991 underwent a radical brain operation that would push her body further toward death than virtually any documented patient before or since. After months of puzzling symptoms, sudden bouts of dizziness, alarming episodes where she would lose the ability to speak, and frightening moments of partial paralysis, doctors discovered a massive aneurysm lodged near the base of her brainstem, a location so dangerous that conventional surgery carried virtually no chance of survival. As a last resort, Dr. Robert Spetzler, a pioneering neurosurgeon at the Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, Arizona, proposed a rarely performed procedure known as a standstill operation, medically termed deep hypothermic circulatory arrest, which had only been used in the most extreme cases. The procedure required bringing Pam's body temperature down to just 50 degrees Fahrenheit, allowing surgeons to stop her heart and breathing entirely and drain every drop of blood from her brain. Once the blood was removed and the electrical chatter of her neurons fell silent, Robert would have a brief window of perhaps 45 to 60 minutes to excise the aneurysm before brain tissue began to die from oxygen starvation. To ensure that Pam's brain was completely non-functioning during the critical phase of the operation, the medical team placed a series of monitors on her head, including electroencephalogram electrodes to measure cortical activity, brainstem auditory evoked response sensors to track neural firing in her midbrain, and loud clicking earphones designed to deliver a constant barrage of sound, ensuring that if any part of her brain remained awake, the clicks would register on the monitors and alert the team. The surgical team worked with extreme precision, removing the aneurysm and reconstructing the damaged artery before gradually rewarming Pam's body, restarting her heart, and returning blood to her brain in a delicate process that took several hours. When Pam awoke, She stunned her doctors by recounting a vivid, detailed experience that she insisted had taken place during the very window when her brain had been clinically dead. She described rising out of her physical body and floating upward until she found herself perched near the ceiling of the operating room, looking down at the scene below, with a clarity she later described as more hyper-aware and focused than ordinary vision. From that elevated vantage point, she claimed to have watched the surgeons as they worked on her inert body, observing details that no anesthetized patient should have been able to see. She recalled seeing the bone saw that Robert used to open her skull. She described it in specific terms. It looked like the handle of an electric toothbrush, with a handpiece connected to a hose supplying pneumatic power. It had small interchangeable bits that were stored in a case resembling the socket wrench set her father kept in their garage when she was a child. When Dr. Michael Sabom, a cardiologist and near-death researcher who interviewed Pam extensively, later requested photographs of the actual surgical instruments used in her operation, he was astonished to discover that her description of the bone saw was entirely accurate, down to the shape of the handpiece and the design of the storage case. Pam also reported hearing conversations among the surgical team during the procedure, including a comment by a female cardiologist who confirmed she had said exactly what Pam recalled. In addition to her out-of-body observations, Pam described a classic near-death experience that followed many of the elements first cataloged by Raymond Moody. She moved through a dark tunnel vortex toward a brilliant pinpoint of light that grew larger and larger. She heard the voice of her deceased grandmother calling to her. She encountered figures bathed in a warm, radiant light. She was met by deceased relatives, including an uncle who gave her something that felt like a sparkly substance to eat. And she experienced an overwhelming sense of peace, love, and the absence of all fear or pain. At one point, she recalled encountering her deceased uncle, who communicated to her that she had to return to her body. She resisted. She looked down at the lifeless form on the operating table and felt no desire whatsoever to re-enter it, describing it as a broken vessel she wanted nothing to do with. Her uncle insisted, reasoning with her and telling her that returning was like diving into a swimming pool, that she should simply jump in. With his encouragement, she reluctantly re-entered her body. She woke up in the recovery room, still intubated, disoriented, and angry at having been sent back to a life of physical limitations and chronic pain. When Dr. Robert Spetzler, the neurosurgeon who had operated on Pam, was later asked whether he could explain her experience through conventional neurological or physiological means, he was remarkably candid. He stated flatly that he did not think the observations she made could have been based on anything she saw or heard while entering the operating theater, because the surgical tools were wrapped in sealed packages that would not have been opened before the procedure. In any case, her eyes had been taped shut. Regarding her reported hearing of conversations, Robert noted that at the stage of the operation she described, no patient in that physiological state could hear through normal auditory pathways, especially given the loud clicking modules placed directly in each of her ears to monitor brainstem function. Not surprisingly, skeptics have offered alternative explanations. Anesthesiologist Dr. Gerald Worley has argued that Pam may have experienced anesthesia awareness, a rare condition in which patients under general anesthesia remain partially conscious and can later recall sounds or sensations from the operating room. Gerald further suggested that Pam could have heard the bone saw through bone conduction, and then unconsciously constructed a visual narrative around those auditory impressions. But critics of Gerald's theory point to several problems. The auditory clicks delivered through the headphones during the operation were loud enough that any sound from the bone saw would have been completely masked. The brainstem auditory evoked response monitors were designed specifically to detect any sound reaching the brain, and during Pam's standstill period, those monitors showed no response whatsoever. Even if vibrations did reach her inner ear, the brain itself couldn't have recalled those sounds as coherent memories. Furthermore, Gerald's explanation fails to account for Pam's visual observations. Bone conduction can carry sound to the cochlea. Still, no known physical mechanism allows a flatline brain to see through closed, taped eyelids positioned at a 90-degree angle to the operating table. But Pam accurately described not just the shape of the bone saw, but the details of its handpiece, its pneumatic hose, its interchangeable bits, and the storage case that held them. all information that simply was not available to any patient under deep hypothermic circulatory arrest. Pam herself rarely spoke publicly about her experience, preferring to live a quiet life as a mother and musician, and she died of heart failure in 2010 at the age of 53. Skepticism is easy when the stories belong to strangers, but every profession has its limit, a moment when the evidence becomes too personal to dismiss. The coma that changed everything. Eben Alexander's story begins in the privileged, data-driven world of academic neurosurgery, a field he had dominated for more than 2 decades. For 15 of those years, Eben served as an associate professor at Harvard Medical School. He had heard the accounts of near-death experiences from patients and had dismissed them as wishful fantasies generated by a brain starved of oxygen or flooded with stress chemicals. Then, on the morning of November 10th, 2008, a sudden and brutal pain in his lower back announced the arrival of an enemy his medical training could not have anticipated. Within hours, the 54-year-old neurosurgeon was lying in a hospital bed, his brain under catastrophic assault from a gram-negative strain of Escherichia coli bacterial meningitis. The bacteria had penetrated his cerebrospinal fluid and were, in the words of his attending physicians, literally eating his brain. As the infection raged, Eben's brain began to swell, herniating downward against his brainstem in a process that is universally fatal in the vast majority of cases. His Glasgow Coma Scale dropped to 8 out of 15, a score that denotes severe brain injury, while his cerebrospinal fluid glucose level fell to a catastrophic 1 milligram per deciliter. A normal level is between 60 and 80. Eben was placed on a ventilator and sedated into a deep coma, a state he would occupy for 7 full days. During that time, magnetic resonance imaging scans of his brain showed that his entire neocortex, the outer layer of the brain responsible for language, logic, sensory perception, and conscious thought, was functionally dead. Eben later wrote that, based on all that is known about how the brain works, he had no capacity while in the coma to create thought. His doctors estimated his chance of survival at a mere 2%, with a near zero chance of anything resembling a normal neurological recovery if he did survive. On the 6th day of the coma, Eben's family gathered in the hospital conference room to hear the attending physicians explain that continuing antibiotics was a losing battle. The bacteria had not responded to treatment, and the only realistic outcome was either death or, at best, a persistent vegetative state in which Eben would never speak, feed himself, or recognize his own children again. Eben's son, Bond, was not present in the conference room, but later that day the 10-year-old boy grabbed his father's hand and begged him to come back. What happened next defied every clinical expectation. Eben woke up, and when the breathing tube was removed from his throat, his first words were an expression of thanks, followed by the phrase, "All is well." Over the next several weeks, Eben's cognition returned in stages, first fragmented, then whole, until he had completely recovered all of his neurosurgical knowledge and motor functions. But it was not merely the physical survival that captured the world's attention. It was what Eben claimed to have seen, heard, and experienced during those 7 days. He described a journey that began in a root-like darkness, where he was aware only of a pounding rhythm and a sense of being underground. From there, he moved upward into a vibrant realm he called the Gateway. According to him, it was a place of overwhelming love that made every human experience of affection seem pale and incomplete. He also heard music and was shown visions of the cosmos, including a glimpse of a great central intelligence that held the entire universe together in a web of conscious awareness. In the final part of his journey, Eben was told, directly and unmistakably, that he was not there to stay, and that he would have to return to his physical body to share what he had learned. Eben spent the next 2 months in a state of what he called intensive care unit psychosis, suffering paranoid fantasies, vivid nightmares, and memory gaps as his brain struggled to reorganize itself. When the fog finally lifted, he made a decision that would change the direction of his life entirely. He wrote down every detail of his experience in a 69-page account, a process that took him 6 weeks to complete. The result was the book titled Proof of Heaven, A Neurosurgeon's Journey into the Afterlife, published by Simon & Schuster in October 2012. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.